interesting how, and we're going to relate this to what we're going to study tonight, it's interesting how different people can read the same account about the second coming and see two different things. All right? And so I want us to remember that as we think about what Matthew is writing here. So let's go to verse 36. This is where we left off last week. So this is Matthew chapter 24. If you're following us at home, Matthew 24, we're going to start in verse 36. We're actually going to read to the end of the chapter. There are two sections here. So the first section is 36 to 41. If you're making notes or trying to see, that's the first section, 36 to 41, and then 42 to 51. That's the second section, two things here that Jesus is talking about. So, verse 36, but concerning that day, so this is the day of the Son of Man coming on the clouds that he talked about back in verse 30. Concerning that day, an hour nobody knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. For as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying, giving in marriage, until the day when Noah entered the ark. And they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. Then 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken, one left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken, and one left. Therefore, stay awake, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. But know this, that if the master of the house had known in what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and would not let his house be broken into. Therefore, you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. Who then is the faithful and wise servant whom his master has set over his household, to give them their proper food at the proper time? Blessed is that servant whom his master will find so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will set him over all his possessions. But if that wicked servant says to himself, my master is delayed, and begins to beat his fellow servants and eats and drinks with drunkards, the master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour he does not know. And he will cut him in pieces and put him with the hypocrites. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. All right? Jesus closes out this first part of the Olivet Discourse. As we start next week in chapter 25, the only thing that Jesus does in chapter 25 is talk about chapter 24. So he's not introducing anything new. We'll pick this up next week. He is just simply going to explain chapter 24. So if you ever read the parable of the virgins and the other things that he's talking about, separating the sheep from the goats, all of that is in retrospect to this chapter. So we'll pick that up and look at what he's talking about next week. So two things that are happening in this particular passage tonight. The first one is the connection between the parousia and Noah in the Old Testament. Remember, parousia is the word that means arrival or coming. And this is the word that the Bible uses for the second coming of Jesus, the parousia. Jesus is teaching about this event, his second coming, and he makes a connection between what's going to happen when he comes back and what has already happened in the Old Testament. If you will pay attention to how Jesus teaches throughout the Gospels, he is constantly pointing us backwards to the Old Testament. He is constantly reminding us of what has already been revealed. And I love that because all of the Old Testament is not just history. Everything that happened in the Old Testament points forward to Jesus. And he's reminding us of that even here. All right, so at the beginning here, he uses the story of Noah to help us understand some things about his second coming. He says, when the Son of Man returns, it's going to be like it was in Noah's day. So let's make that connection. Let's try to figure out how those two things are connected. One of the things that he talks about is that his second coming is going to happen like the flood. So he's not just thinking about the person of Noah, but he's thinking about what happened in the days of Noah. That Christ is going to return just like the flood happened, and that daily life is going to be going on just as it has done for years. He talks about here how that people are going to be going about their ordinary lives. They're going to be doing the same things that they do every day. They'll be involved in normal, everyday, common activity, and then Jesus is going to come back. He talks about that. In the days before the flood, people were eating and drinking and marrying and giving in marriage. All of that was going on, all this normal activity, up until the day that Noah entered the ark. And notice what he says here. They all knew nothing about what was going to happen until the flood started. Now, if you think back, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on Noah, but we want to think what Jesus is teaching us in the days of Noah that pertain to what he's doing and what he's teaching here about the second coming. There is nothing in the story of Noah, which is Genesis 6 or Genesis 9, that says that Noah warned people that a flood was coming. He could have done that. The Bible doesn't say that he went around knocking on doors telling people there's a flood coming. It does say that he prepared. And we think about that event and we think, well, wait a minute, it rained for so long. Certainly people had to become aware of, hey, it's rained for 10 days or 15 days or 20 days. But remember, and again, we're not going to go back and look at the details. Remember that the flood was a sudden event. Yes, it rained, but the majority of the flood didn't come down. The majority of the water came up. So the ground broke open and it was a sudden rush of water. It was raining, but the majority of the water came up from the ground. But there was probably a lot of confusion about what he was doing, why this big boat. I think there's some evidence too that maybe it had never rained before. That there was, in fact, in the garden, it says that the Lord caused, there was like a canopy, like a rainforest type atmosphere in the world, that it didn't need to rain. It just, everything was watered from the ground. So there's a possibility people had never seen rain before. So they had no idea when water started falling from the sky. But it wasn't, I think the point that Jesus is trying to connect here is that it wasn't something they had plenty of time to get ready for. It was a sudden event, just all of a sudden the floods. Now, I'm a believer. It is my conviction it was a global flood. It wasn't just localized. It wasn't just there. I believe the entire world was flooded, and all life that had breath in their lungs, it all died in that. So this is Jesus saying that just like what happened in the days of Noah, that the same thing is going to happen at the coming of the Son of Man. And this is what I want you to see. How did Noah respond? Noah believed that prophecy and prepared himself and his family. A strange request: build a boat. Anybody ever been to the Ark Encounter in Kentucky? Good gracious alive. If you have never been, you need to make plans to go. And you need to eat your Wheaties before you go as well, because we spent all day up there. I only saw a small portion of it. It is just incredible, a life-size replica of the Ark. So this is not, what was Gilligan's boat, the SS Minnow? This was it. I mean, it takes your breath away. It takes your breath away, and you can see it from a long way off. And as you drive into it, it just, so this is something Noah. God told Noah, and Noah said, "Okay, no questions, just started believe what God told him," and he started preparing himself and his family. So nobody knew the day, nobody knew the hour that the flood was going to take place. And so then how do we connect what Jesus is talking about here with the flood? Here's what's important. The comparison between the time of Noah and the return of the Son of Man centers on the suddenness of the events. That's what Jesus is trying to communicate. And we just read that. Like he talks about that over and over. Like it's going to happen everybody's going to be just going about their business, doing their thing, living their life, going about life as ever. And boom, it's going to happen. Okay? So just as the flood started, it provided no warning. And same thing with the second coming of Jesus, that there's not going to be a whole lot of signs that are going to warn people that he's coming. And this is sort of goes back. We're not going to take time to do it tonight, but it goes back to the very first part of when we started studying in chapter 24. Remember the suddenness of the destruction of the temple. So again, we're connecting all these dots here. Now, there's something interesting right here that I want to point out to you. There's some disagreements here, and holy disagreements, okay? Just differences. And I asked that question, how do different people look at the same picture and see two different things? There are two, look at verses 40 and 41, okay? There are two ways to interpret verses 40 and 41. Anybody want to guess what they are? Remember the context. Verses 40 and 41, we can't rip those two verses out of what Jesus said right before it. Days of Noah. Just like it was in the days of Noah. All right, so two ways to interpret verses 40 and 41. It is the believer that is taken and the unbeliever left behind. That's one way. Okay, two in the field, one taken, one left. The believer taken, the unbeliever left behind. Here's a second way to interpret it. It is the unbeliever that is taken and the believer left behind.
That's basically what I said.
Yes, ma'am.
Sure, got it. We know.
Yeah. Okay, now, the first one of those, you're probably a lot more comfortable with. You've probably heard that view before. The second one, the bottom one, you may have, not even considered that. But again, these two things in the context of the flood, because that's what Jesus, he already established that, just like in the days of Noah. So verses 40 and 41 is in the context of the flood. Who was taken in the flood? The wicked. Who was left? Okay. So if you're somebody who's a premillennial, you probably see this passage as the rapture. Yeah, two people working, Jesus comes back, the believer's taken, and the unbeliever is left. If you're a post-millennial, all right, and you may not know exactly what those are, but if you believe that Jesus comes back at the end of the millennial reign, then you may say, well, just like with Noah, God took the wicked out of the world and left the righteous in the world. And so that's what God is doing, that right now we are advancing and we are creating God's kingdom on earth, Christ's kingdom on earth. And when we get done with that, when the wicked are taken away and the only thing that's left in the world are the righteous, then Jesus returns back to the earth. All right? Now, admittedly, there's not a lot of support to be post-millennial. There are some people who are. Most people are in this top one right here. But there is some disagreement here. And I just find it interesting that Jesus says, just like in Noah's day. Okay, well, in Noah's day, the wicked were taken. And the righteous were left. All right, so there's just different ways, to look at that. There's some famous theologians, if you've heard of some of these. I mean, these are giants. These are not just differences of opinion, but giants in the faith. John Owen, Jonathan Edwards, Charles Hodge. I mean, these are people who, investigated this, and some of them came down on one side, and some of them came down on the other side. But if you look at both of those interpretations, do either of these interpretations change anything about the central truth of what Jesus is teaching? It doesn't ready.
But when you get into the book of Revelation,
Yep.
I think the book of Revelation backs up the first one.
There is a lot more evidence in the book of Revelation for premillennial that the rapture, there's a secret coming first when not only Revelation, but 1 Thessalonians 4, the dead in Christ shall rise first, and the rest will be caught up with him in the air. So yes, there's a lot more support for the believers taken out. But I do find it interesting that Jesus would use the context of Noah to describe what it's going to be like in the second coming. That the wicked were taken and the righteous were left. And regardless, it doesn't change the main thing. Jesus is coming back. And we got to be prepared for that. That's right. Okay? So that's the first thing, was the connection between the parousia and Noah. Here's the second thing we want to think about for a minute, and that is the conversation about the parousia and the church. And there may be some other minor things that we could go and explore on this a little bit, but I just want to think about, just see these two things in this, that yes, there is a connection to the Old Testament with Noah, but then Jesus is giving us instructions here in terms of how we are to think and how we are to talk about the second coming. All right, so he gives, I think, a final and specific answer. He doesn't talk about this anymore when he gets over to chapter 25. So I think this is sort of the final way of Jesus answering this second question. What will be the sign of your coming? When is the end of the age going to happen? And the final and specific answer that Jesus gives is verse 36. No one knows the day. No one knows the hour. Don't you find it interesting that he says the angels don't know, even the Son doesn't know? And that creates all kinds of questions in my mind. What do you mean the Son? Is there some things that God knows that Jesus doesn't know? And that's some deep water, and we're not going to try to explore that tonight. But he does say that. Nobody knows the day. Nobody knows the hour. Only the Father knows, much less the people on earth. So angels, the Son, none of them know, much less people who are living on the earth. So I think what Jesus is doing here is he's emphasizing the fact that the disciples' question of when, which every single one of us, we're asking that too. Right? The disciples' question of when is really not the right question, and isn't something that we should spend so much of our time focused on. And we talked about this at the beginning when we started studying the Olivet Discourse, that Jesus is trying to turn our attention away from the day and hour to something that's more important, which is being prepared and being ready for that. So, obviously I think it's okay. It's absolutely nothing wrong. In fact, it's fascinating. It's interesting to watch and observe the world events as it relates to the teachings of Scripture, but watching and observing and looking for harbingers and secret codes and hidden messages and all of those things is not going to be able to help us predict the day and the hour of His return. None of those things are going to be able to help us. Yes. Yes, that's a huge mystery. And one of the things that helps me with that is that Jesus as the Son is not limited in His relationship with the Father. But even when Jesus was walking around on earth, there were several instances in the Gospels where it seemed like His knowledge of things was limited. Not in the sense that it diminished His divinity, but that maybe He chose to operate more out of His humanity in some things rather than His divinity. I think it's super mysterious. It's super hard to try to figure out how is it that Jesus can be God but not know what the Father knows. And it could be that in this language here that Jesus is not is not admitting that there's some cognitive issues with him, like, I don't know, but that he's not the one to to announce or to say or to be the one that tells people when it's going to be. It could be in his mind, he's saying that's a responsibility of the Father and not me. I certainly would agree that it's that rather than that it's responsibility, not capability. He's capable of knowing, but it's not his responsibility to announce that. I don't know. That's the honest answer. I don't know how is it that Jesus can be God, but as the Son, he's limited in either his knowledge of when that is. I remember hearing my dad would say, talking about this, he would say, Jesus is sitting at the right hand of God, and he doesn't know when it's going to be, when the second coming is going to be, and he's going to sit there, and just one day the Father's going to say, okay, son, go get my children and bring them home. He would preach that over and over. And that may certainly be true, but as far as how his knowledge is limited as God, I don't know. And that's not a sufficient answer, I know. But I do know that in his humanity in the Gospels, we see several times where he was not aware, of certain, or chose to limit himself in certain things. Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah. So Jesus wants, this is on your handouts, Jesus wants our conversations focused on something else other than prediction. He wants us focused on preparation. So good to wonder, good to ask, good to watch and observe and listen. But again, the question of when, I think Jesus wants us to turn our attention to rather than prediction, but to be prepared. I want to show you a picture that was on my Twitter feed. I know it's not Twitter anymore, it's X. But I saw it yesterday and I took a screenshot of it. And I follow different religious figures and friends, things from seminary and others. This is an actual picture from my Twitter feed. And it says, breaking news, if you can't see it, breaking news, multiple ancient prophecies, astronomical events, global developments are converging on one specific date. September 23rd and 24th, 2025 could change everything. Here's why millions of Christians believe the rapture might happen in just 47 days. Yeah, that's right. And I did not. I did not want to hear and see the rest of that. But now that grabs my attention. But specific date, and Jesus says nobody's going to know the hour or the day. Now watch it happen, and we won't care. We won't be remembering stuff like that when it happens. But, it's funny, and there have been many, hundreds of these prophecies that haven't come true. I kind of laugh to myself because I think the more that this comes out, somebody's going to be right at some point. Somebody's going to check the date, and they'll be right. Yep. That's a good point. There is, depending on your view of eschatology, yes, he's not just going to show up on the scene and be this horrible person. That he's going to provide some measure of like a peace treaty. He'll be this global leader that will bring peace and joy, and everybody will love him. And again, this is Daniel chapter 9, chapter 11, that after 1,290 days, he's going to break his word. He's going to break that peace treaty, and then all heck is going to break loose, and that's the end of the back end of the tribulation. So yeah, think about all of that's got to be in place and in 47 days. Unless we already know who the Antichrist is. We just don't recognize him yet. Because he could be a world leader right now. No, ma'am, I do not. I want to hurry up and finish this. But yes, sir. Yep. Now, you're right in line with, a lot of this that we read, but we're not going verse by verse about the master come if you knew when the thief was going to, you'd be on guard. Like, we don't have any of that detail. We're just told we're to be ready. That's what Jesus says. We're to be ready. And again, great to study and figure out, and what does the red heifers mean, and is there a third temple being built? Like, I love thinking about all that stuff. But if I'm so focused on prediction that I'm not out here warning people and preparing them, then I've missed the whole point of the Olivet Discourse, which is, number one, get prepared, me and my family, which is what Noah did. And then God preserved Noah, and then used Noah to, create the nation of Israel, which would be a blessing to the whole world, out of which the Messiah would come. So there's a gospel story in the ark. The gospel is in Genesis 6, 7, 8, and 9. So yeah, be ready, and you want to stay up to date on some of these other things. That's great. But the main thing is that Jesus said He's coming, and He's going to come back. And when He comes back, He's going to bring an end to sin, and an end to sickness, and an end to death. This is like going to be the ultimate victory that He's going to bring in, and He wants us to be intentional about the time that we have. I was thinking about this today. I had a meeting with a group of guys today, and just had a fabulous time. Evans, I did not know there was a meeting room and a pottery place in the back of that. And that's where we were today. It was like 15 of us all crammed in there. It was glorious. Man, it was cool. And so you get pastors and missionaries together. We were talking about influence and intentionality and all that. And I got to sharing a few things, thinking, I'm 52 years old. I may have 25 years left. If the Lord tarries, I'll be 77 years old. 25 years, I hope y'all still have me when I'm 77. But I got 25 years left. That's not a lot of time. And some of us have a little more. And some of us have, and we don't know, right? We don't know. It's just, we only have a limited time to prepare people for the most important event in world history. And so, yes, we got to be ready. Yeah, and you're talking about a different law at work. That was, the Mosaic law, and that would come. That's the age of the law. Now we're in the age of grace. And so there is a sense in which God would provide for the good news of the gospel to go out at some point, but not at that point with Noah. But it is different with us today. I know that that's true, but there are a lot of people across the world that have never heard of Jesus. They've never heard of this. A lot of people that, here in the South, we've grown up with it since Vacation Bible School. I remember just 2 years ago when I was teaching a VBS Bible class of children, and there was a 6th grade girl who lived in that community, and I was sharing the gospel, the story, crucifixion and resurrection, on Thursday night of Vacation Bible School, and this little girl had never heard the story of Jesus. And she started openly weeping, and having a conversation with her. She'd never heard that before. She didn't know anything about. So, there are few and far between here in the Bible Belt, but across the world, you go to places like India. You go to places that do not have access to the gospel like we do. They don't know. They've never heard. That's a good point, because we see this all over the place. Many of us, we grew up in the Deep South, and if you lived in the Deep South, you were from the Deep South. But there's a lot more people who are not from the Deep South who are moving into the Deep South. A lot more people. I know when Charlie and I spent a summer up in New England and all these northern states, it's like a different planet up there, that in terms of their exposure to the gospel and those kinds of things. So I do think that that's a good point, that there are more people around us. We just assume that everybody knows what we know, or we know we've heard of God, we've heard of Jesus. But there are a lot of people, more and more people who live right around us that they haven't heard. So I love the point of Jesus here is to not just draw attention to ourselves individually, but to get in our cars and drive home tonight and drive by all these homes and be thinking about, are they prepared? I'm prepared, but are they prepared? And it causes us to think a little bit differently. I love this scripture. We're almost done. 2 Peter 3, 11 and 12. Since all these things are to be destroyed in this way, what sort of people ought you to be? He's talking to the church. What kind of people are you ought to be in holy conduct and godliness, looking for and hastening the coming day of God? And Peter has just been talking about the end of the age and how all these things are going to happen. And he's saying to the church, since y'all know this stuff's going to happen, how do you think that ought to change the way we live our lives? And that we should be mindful of that constantly. And all of those things, it leads Jesus to say, be alert, stay awake, right? Verse 42. That's the whole point. That's what he ends chapter 24 with. Stay awake, stay alert. All right? And but the next chapter is about verse 42. So everything that we're going to study in chapter 25 is about staying alert. Now, here's what I want to end today, and with this thought: how can Christians stay awake? I don't mean in Sunday morning sermon when the pastor just keeps preaching and preaching and preaching, and it's too long. But how do we do what Jesus is reminding us to do at the end of this chapter? How do we stay alert? Listen? And I think that's obviously biblical, because there's so many times that it talks about here. Why would you, here at the end of this chapter, when the master comes back, what is he going to find you doing? Verse 48, 49, 50, the master is going to come on a day when he does not expect him. What do I want to be found doing whenever Jesus comes back? What's another way we can stay alert, stay awake? Okay? Yep. Amen. Stay close to Jesus. Abide in Him. I think that is probably one of the most important ways. Keep your relationship with Jesus close, drawing near to Him. That's good. What else? How do we stay awake and stay alert? Okay? Just tell people about Jesus. I wrote down, pray for my lost friends. Like, how often do I think about my friends who are lost? I need to be praying for them. And then what Joe and others, think about it more often, talk about it more often. I spent some time with some missionaries today. Maybe we ought to go on a mission trip. Maybe we ought to talk to a missionary and connect with somebody who is living on mission every single day somewhere across the world. I spent time with a guy who's a missionary in Spain, and was with the IMB, and his daughter just moved into CIU. She's a freshman at CIU, and the only thing this guy talked about all day long was living on mission. Like, his whole life revolved around advancing the gospel. And many of us, we're not called to be missionaries in a foreign land, but we are called to live and think and behave in such a way that we know He's coming back. All right, anything else? Any other thoughts, questions, anything else before we go?